The question spills out of that crowd on Pentecost. What does this mean? They're standing shoulder to shoulder. You see them in the street, the cobbles beneath their feet. It's narrow, these alleyways and streets, but this sound has come through. It's been a hurricane force, and it's rattled the shutters, blown out the candles. It's like what happens around here when the power company all of a sudden loses power, and all the neighbors are out in the street talking to each other. What's going on? What's happened? There they are, all of them spilling into the streets, and they begin to hear these Galileans talking in their own native lingo, their hometown speech. And as they're standing there in the midst of that, they nudge one another and they say, "What's it mean? What does this mean?" Say to one another, "What does this mean?" The story of Pentecost, it taps us with questions. We might wonder as well what it means for us. Jesus' friends suddenly speaking Portuguese and Spanish, Turkish, Hindi. What's it mean? We who are church, we put meaning on that ancient story. We look at it, and at least on one level, we say, surely what this means is that God is here in this experience with these folks babbling in languages. Surely God has bent the heavens and come down, has torn a hole and is present with these people in this moment. At least it means that. Maybe from another perspective, on another level, maybe we're willing to say that perhaps this God who has come down, this God isn't some localized deity. There was this concept that every nation had its own gods. The Romans had their gods, the Greek had their gods, the Babylonians had their gods, and Israel had this God. But now, suddenly in this moment, can we dare to imagine, as people from 3 different continents, at least 12 nations, as they're gathered there and they look different from one another, and they're hearing this in their own tongue, can we imagine that this God is not some localized deity, but this God speaks across difference? Can we imagine that? And maybe, just maybe a little deeper yet, that this God, unlike the other gods, doing this odd thing. Religion's always been set up with, who's at the top of the pecking order in a religion? It's the priests and the high priest and all these muckety-muck folk. And suddenly, in this moment. The holy is not resting just on the Christian educator or the elder, but that the Spirit's coming, this wind of God, this breath's coming to rest on the community, the whole people, not just the folks at the top. As if in this moment there is this movement of the holy that's bringing about a kind of democratic equality. So that the day will come when we will not need to nudge one another to say, know the Lord, because why? The Spirit will rest on God's people, and each person will know. So Pentecost, when we ask what does it means at least those three things. Of course, from our distance out here, all these many years later, Pentecost, we look at it and it feels like surely it's a dazzling moment. It's a wonder, and yet we have retreated. We have retreated from Pentecost. At Pentecost, there is an inclusion. And we, in our denominational systems, we have backed away from that unity. In our time, tribalism has reemerged, and we are again segregated into our silos. The current culture fans our fears and promotes our mistrust of different. If we look different, if we sound different, then we're afraid. If God is shattering the old mold of the way culture and life was to be worked, shattering it there on the day of Pentecost, we have retreated into our own little bubbles. If God had allowed it, that early community, they would have talked Aramaic. And they would have huddled down there in a suburb of Jerusalem. They would have become just another one of the Jewish cults. But Pentecost occurs, and it's like this rocket that sends them in a trajectory out into an ever-broadening expanse of God's encounter with humanity, and it's in that trajectory that we keep pulling back. We're more comfortable in our little bubble of whiteness, our bubble of living in suburbia, in our bubbles of being just all the same. Whereas God is in the business of busting bubbles so that finally, at last, humanity will come together. Will Willimon, he's a bishop in the Methodist Church. He was out visiting one of the big churches where they have a breakfast program. They feed 200 homeless people every morning. And so Willimon was there to to encourage their ministry, and he ended up in the kitchen talking to the folks who were helping. He finds the guy who's, up to his elbows in the sink, scrubbing up the pots and pans after making breakfast. Turns out he's a rather well-known lawyer in that area of the world, and so Wilmon goes up to him and says, "You must love ministering to homeless people." And the lawyer looks at him and he says, as if to say, "You're crazy. Have you met any of these homeless people? They're really messed up. Most of them, their families don't want them around. That's why they're homeless." So then Wilmon's puzzling, what's this mean? And he says to him, "So how did you get here if you don't like ministering to homeless people?" And the lawyer looks at him and says, "Jesus put me here." The trajectory that begins at Pentecost is that Jesus and the Spirit are going to put us places that we're not comfortable in order that we might speak the healing wholeness that God is bringing into the world to people we don't know yet, who are different. So Pentecost just keeps going. It isn't a back then moment. It is this trajectory that keeps broadening God's reach, so that we will live into that promise that the young and the old will dream dreams and see visions. Brothers and sisters, it's happening. The young, the millennials. Yesterday there was a wedding. Did you see it? Who would have believed a child of slavery? Married into the royal house of England. Who would have believed? It's a Spirit doing. When the women of Michigan rise up, and they are rising up to stand against gerrymandering in the state of Michigan that is causing unequal voting rights. When the women of Michigan stand up and say no to gerrymandering, it's Spirit-filled moment. When you get nudged to write a check for a water well out of which you'll never drink a drop, it's a Spirit-filled moment. When you go sit with a friend who's in crisis, and you hold their hand, and you dare to pray, it's a Spirit-filled time. And when we in Michigan come together and say with one voice that we need to reform education in the state of Michigan, so that every child of our state has the opportunity to have the best education possible. It is Holy Spirit leading us. God has unleashed God's Spirit on the world to create an equality among us. The old will dream dreams, the young will see visions, God's Spirit. Men, of course, but women too. There is a democracy within Pentecost. The challenge for us, of course, is to be open to the Spirit. Not to back away when the Spirit nudges us, pushes us, propels us beyond our comfort. Pentecost is now. Pentecost is now. Amen.